Okay, what I want to do today is we're going to get into the territorial period, or basically, if you want to, the period of American control. So first, let's take a look at this, which I think is still, yeah. If you want to think about what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, you had the period of basically Hawaiian values, which would be basically up to the 1820s, 1830s. You have this contested period, which would basically, in some ways, you could sort of say is the monarchy, between whether Hawaiian values are going to remain dominant or if this new set of values brought in by Americans, most extravagantly by the missionary boys, i.e. the children of the missionaries, the Calvinist values are going to be dominant. And over time, what happens is, especially because of the economic and political relationships with the United States, is more and more the Hawaiian values get subsumed by this, which is sort of seen as being the Euro-American value system, which of course is the great colonial global order of the period. So what happens is, to show you, when you're looking at this chart, you can sort of visualize that over time, the right hand or Hawaiian set gets essentially devalued and gets replaced by the left-hand side. And you can see this if you look, for example, at the Hawaiian Constitution of 1839. On one hand, it has aspects of this, because in part it was written by the Calvinists who were already working for the government. But on the other part, a lot of it is very heavily in this idea of the Hawaiian value system. By the Bayonet Constitution, 1878, this has become by far the major part of the, sort of the legal structure of the monarchy, and this is very much devalued. When we become a territory, then of course this ceases to exist, except for one option or one aspect. And what happens is the American system, Bill of Rights, the Constitution, all that stuff, is very, very, very explicitly Calvinist, especially the Bill of Rights, which almost looks like it had been written by a group of New England missionaries. So what happens when we become part of the United States, of course, the laws of the United States become the legal system we now operate under. And to a certain extent, at least initially, no one was interested in what had happened before that, because now you're part of the United States, so who cares what you were in the past? The only place it turns out to be a complicated situation is, again, if you remember, I think I mentioned last time, we have that 5-year period where we're a republic. The monarchy's been overthrown by the missionary boys, and they basically instituted a republic. But because they hadn't planned on it working out that way, they basically just took monarchy law and applied it with a few exceptions. Especially they kept the whole land holding thing, because of course that's how they'd end up with these huge estates, and this is how they ended up with all the money they had. So they weren't dumb enough to change that. When they become part of the United States, when the Republic becomes part of the United States in 1898, 1899, the deal they do with the United States is, we'd like to be part of the United States, but we've got this sort of system set up. So, we're going to do this without any trouble, and we're going to make you all happy about this, et cetera, at least the government was. And so what we want, though, is what we want you guys to do is accept the aspects of monarchy law that aren't in contradiction to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And the American government, as we'll see, for a whole set of reasons, goes, okay. They were already having trouble in the Philippines with a massive revolt that went on for 4 years and was really bloody. In Cuba, the anti-American sentiment, because the Americans take over Cuba from the Spanish in 1898, the Cubans immediately revolt against the Americans, and eventually the Americans back out and leave it alone. Puerto Rico, which was taken over at the same time, was involved in a really heavy-scale violence against American takeover. So the Americans suddenly realized in 1898 they were doing this, and for some reason, I don't know if it was naively or they didn't care. Maybe their experience with Indians was such that it was never an issue. They just figured that everyone would be happy to be American. It was so ethnocentric, I suspect. And they were so shocked when basically all these places that had thought they were getting independence suddenly were told, oh, by the way, you're now part of the United States. And they were totally unhappy about that. And the American public was upset because all of a sudden Americans were now dying in what would now be days sort of called foreign wars. And so it was these were hugely unpopular. The Philippines conflict was actually the most brutal in terms of American casualties right up to the Vietnam War. So, there was no popular sentiment in the United States for keeping these places if they didn't want to be part of it. So in many cases, they sort of get dropped like a hot potato. So in that situation, when Hawaii as a country is saying we'll be part of the United States and we won't give you any trouble as long as you agree to X, the Americans just signed on the dotted line and they were out of there. So what happens is, if you want to think of the territorial period, the right-hand side of this thing vanishes. And it's replaced by left-hand side only. Except that the land rights and such that these guys had, plugged into the system in 1899 to be part of the United States remained. Now, where this comes into play is if you end up doing legal stuff here in the state of Hawaii, you actually have 3 legal codes. You have the federal legal code, i.e. the statutes of the country of the United States, and those take dominance because that's the country, that's the things defined by Congress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Second level is actually considered monarchy law, because those are the laws that the United States accepted when the United States brought Hawaii into the United States package when it became a territory. Third is state law, because the state wasn't instituted until 1959. So if you actually study law here in Hawaii, and you're dealing with anything that relates to the past, whether it be, for example, land law, beach access, environmental issues, you have to know 3 types of law. Everywhere else in the United States, you've only got 2, federal law and state law. Here in Hawaii, you've got the third, which is monarchy law, which is why UH Law School's classes look really different than many other places. And we're the only place that has that. Now, what that also means, sort of in a weird sense, if you're interested in the law, is the Hawaii Supreme Court has a huge amount of power vis-a-vis other state Supreme Courts. Because if it's some sort of an issue that's dealing with Hawaiian land rights or other issues about Hawaiian stuff that's tied to the old monarchy law, which was written originally in Hawaiian and then translated to English by Thrum, by the way, then what happens is the US Supreme Court will not hear those cases generally. They will tell this Hawaii Supreme Court, which is the highest level of courts that actually understands Hawaiian law, to make the judgment. And almost invariably, the US Supreme Court then abides by it, because they figure they're not going to get into something they don't understand. So the legal system here in Hawaii is unique in the entire United States, because there's this third body of law, which is monarchy law, which becomes, ironically now it's becoming ever more important. And it's a source of enormous confusion with a lot of stuff in terms of, are you talking about stuff that's a state law? How does monarchy law get involved? And all these are subsumed under federal law. So it's a very sort of furball situation. So on one hand, the Calvinist value system, or for our purposes, the American value system, becomes completely dominant in 1899 when we're a territory. And the Hawaiian system disappears legally, or I should say socially, as a powerful compact. Having said that, legally, the Hawaiian system is still extant in 2020 under monarchy law, because that was the actual original agreement written by the United States government and the Republic of Hawaii. So it's not subject to being, well, I suppose maybe the United States could dissolve it or something like that, but that would have so many political consequences internationally that it wouldn't be worth it to be a disaster. So that's sort of how that plays out. So let's go back into history here a little bit. Oops. Okay. Actually, wait. So let's switch pictures here. Okay, we've got to do a little quick technology story here. Okay, this is a British warship, the HMS Hyacinth. I think this is 1905 or something like that. She's in Honolulu Harbor. I think that's the old coaling station here, which is now where the petroleum tanks are on Ivalai. So she's tied up here. Now, the reason we've got this picture is to understand how Hawaii becomes so geopolitically important in the 19th century, you have to look at a ship like this. 60 or 80 years earlier, all she would have had would be mast, and she would have run on sails. This is a classic example of a ship from the mid-late 19th century. In fact, she's in the early 20th century. I think she was one of the China ships. So what you've got is you've got these types of ships. If you notice, there's a weird combination of stuff going on here. On one hand, she has mast and sails, which means she moves by wind. On the other hand, she's got this smokestack. So she's run by coal. She's run by steam. This is a steamship. This is the way steamships were designed right into the early 20th century. And the reason was very simple. One is steam is a very inefficient way to generate energy. So what you'd do is you'd have boilers down here, you'd burn coal just like a choo-choo train. And with that power, you then, the steam that's generated from that, you'd then run a propeller and that runs the ship. But the reason they have the sails is very simple, and that's the fact that right into the early 20th century, coal was so inefficient as an energy source, but it was the best one you could use to generate heat for steam, is that you couldn't carry enough on this ship to actually go really long distances. This ship, for example, could not have sailed from San Francisco to, say, Hong Kong on the coal she had in her. She would have to, somewhere along the line, probably very early, would immediately have to pop out her sails and use sail power to get most of the way. And if she needed to speed up maybe a little bit of this, she's probably got about enough coal in this thing to maybe go about 1,500 miles, which would only get her about half the way from San Francisco to here. So what you had was the steamships in the 19th century. They were much faster than they had been under sail to a certain extent. They had the great advantage if all of a sudden the wind craps out, you still got this. So this is the way you did stuff. Hang on a second. Let's see what's good. Oh, no problem. So what you've got is you've got this system set up with this technology. And this is the only technology you've got, whether it be warships or passenger ships or cargo ships. It's this combination of steam and sail. Now in that, what you have to do is if you've only got enough coal to get you part of the way, but it's a lot faster to use this than it is to use this, you want to minimize the amount of sail time. And this is where all of a sudden Hawaii becomes radically important. Our geographic location in the Pacific means that we're 2,400 miles from almost any place on the West Coast. And that includes whether it be Vancouver, British Columbia, Seattle, San Francisco, San Diego, wherever. And we're about 4,000 to 5,000 miles from any place on this coast. And we're the only place around here that's large enough to do anything like this in this whole 2/3 of the North Pacific Ocean. So not surprising when coal starts to become popular. We'd already been a replenishing spot for ships coming in that want to repair sails and get food. But all of a sudden, when coal comes in, we become absolutely critical, because if you want to think of it, we're the only gas station in the entire Northern Pacific Ocean. And the monarchy very quickly realizes this, starts to make a fair amount of money out of this. Now, the United States by the 1860s, 1870s is starting to grow. By the 1860s, 1870s, the Western states are now states. There's an enormous amount of trade going out of places like San Francisco, which of course we tied into. But a lot of this trade is starting to move into Asia. Resources in Asia, the type of stuff, the manufactured goods in Asia coming across to the United States, because otherwise you had to go all the way around the globe. You had to go around the Atlantic to Europe and then through, and you had European middlemen, etc. So American industry and American retail and all the rest of that, just like they do today, very quickly realized there was an enormous advantage to using the Pacific, because that meant it was a one-stop shop. In that, however, you needed to have a place to fill up on coal and such so that you could make the trip effectively without, crapping out and having the sucker shut down. And this is why when we developed the Reciprocity Treaty in the 1870s with the United States, the United States really has no request of the Hawaiian monarchy except one: to make the request that the Hawaiian government dredge the channel into pearl locks and allow the U.S. Navy to set up a coaling station right here at pearl locks for the purpose of fueling American naval vessels who are going to be in the Pacific. And the reason the reason Hawaiian government agreed to that, one, is because you didn't want to piss off the United States because they're larger, and also they're our main economic partner. But secondly is the mutual protection agreement with the United States, which had existed right up to the Revolution. In fact, during the Revolution in 1893, was the United States Navy would protect Hawaiian interest. So Hawaii didn't have to have a Navy or an Army, because the United States would do that for us. And this sort of scratch my back, scratch your back. If the Americans are going to do this, then it's only reasonable that you give them a coaling station so the ships can refuel if they're going to be protecting you in the first place. This was the major first relationship with the United States. It wasn't economic, it was a political military relationship driven by the geopolitical needs the United States was starting to realize it had that could be best filled by Hawaii. This is one reason when the British and the French, again in the late 1870s, 1880s, start sniffing around Hawaii in terms of making us a colony. The Americans get totally angry about it, because it would completely shut themselves off from the Pacific and isolate the United States as a country. So the Americans get increasingly aggressive about Hawaii for geopolitical reasons and economic reasons, not with what Hawaii is in terms of what Hawaii's got, but where Hawaii is. So think of that ship with its mixed sail and steam power this becomes absolutely central. So for example, by the 1880s, when the United States breaks the Reciprocity Treaty and says that you can't trade stuff with the United States, you know, as if you're part of the United States keeps the Iroquois Point coaling station, even though the Hawaiian government says they want it back. The United States says over our dead body. So for all intents and purposes, from the 1880s right into 1898, the United States has an illegal piece of property in the Hawaiian Islands that it's keeping for strategic need vis-a-vis what it sees as its main enemies. Now you have to remember the main enemies to the United States are the Europeans, Germans, the French, the British. You know, we don't trust any of the European countries. So the United States was real paranoid about what they were up to, and between the British and the French and then later the Germans, they'll have massive Pacific Island colonies. So that's what the Americans are worried about, especially the British with Australia and New Zealand and such like that. So the need of the US Navy drives this. When we become a territory, the main reason the United States accepts, and I should point out just as a note, that's why the US Navy gets involved militarily in the takeover, the overthrow of the monarchy. It's the US Navy Marines and seamen and their guns, and the two cruisers offshore threatening to bombard Honolulu, that makes the Queen give up the monarchy in 1893. It isn't the missionary boys and the local, you know, which was only about 75 guys that are saying they're going to overthrow the Hawaiian government. No one cared what they thought, but no one was going to go to war with the United States. The Queen wasn't going to have it. So at that point, she surrenders, and we eventually then sort of fall into being a republic. So the United States military was an intentional collusion, or I should say the military forces here in 1893 were actually the major force behind the overthrow of the monarchy, which ironically those naval forces here were supposed to protect. And there was a mutual defense treaty. So the monarchy was screwed. They were reamed by the US Navy. The Navy establishment here in the Commodore was running under. And that's one reason that embarrassment of what the Navy did unilaterally without Washington's okay was one reason why the US government wouldn't take Hawaii as part of the United States in 1893, because it looked so bad. Here you had a mutual agreement to protect each other, and you go and basically mug the other guy. And it just made the United States look like a total shit globally in terms of international affairs. The United States just backs away and says we disavow any knowledge of this action, or however you want to phrase it. So it takes about 6 years for the dust to settle, and then you can go back and do it. The big pressure to bring in Hawaii in 1898, 1899 to the United States as a territory was the US Navy, who not only wanted to keep that coaling station, which they still needed, ships largely still ran off of coal, but by that time this had been dredged, and they suddenly realized that they had this enormous, one of the best harbors in the entire Pacific, in Pearl Locks, which was now being renamed Pearl Harbor. And so in that situation, what they want to do is take this over. And so they were the enormous push for the American government, who really saw no value in Hawaii. For the rest of the United States, Hawaii was some weirdly weird place in the Pacific with weird people that did weird stuff, and there's almost no haoles there. So it didn't seem like a logical place for Americans to get involved. But for the US Navy, it was. And their argument for the rest of Congress and everyone else was, if we have the Hawaiian Islands, but most specifically Pearl Harbor, the Hawaiian Islands are almost irrelevant. If we had Pearl Harbor, then we basically controlled the entire Northern Pacific. So it's important to remember that from the start, even prior to the territorial, but from the territorial pillar on, we're mainly saying it as a military establishment. Our relationship with the United States is in terms of what we are relevant to the US military, not more relevant to the US civilian population or economic interest. You know, if you're some big company in San Francisco, Hawaii's never going to be a huge part of your business. It's too far away, it's too small, it's relatively poor. So until tourism pops up in the late 20th century, Hawaii is completely off the charts in terms of anyone's interest, except for the military. Now, what happens all of a sudden in 1914, and this is the story we're going to go through, is all of a sudden this radically changes. Okay, if you're familiar real quickly, I'll try to go this as quickly as possible, but it's hugely important in terms of how we get seen. 1914, World War I starts. The United States immediately backs off. The United States stays neutral, right, for the next 3 years till mid-1917. But almost everyone else, that's why it's called a world war. Almost everyone else gets their fingers in the pie on one side or the other. In the Pacific, on the one side, you have the French, the British, who are your two big powers in the Pacific, Immediately, of course, they're declaring war on Germany and whatever, I can't even remember what they called that, the German power, the German, Austrian, whatever it was. And the Russians, who of course have Vladivostok, were also on the side of the Allies in World War I. Now, the other force that jumps right in is the Japanese. The Japanese had very close ties with England anyways. And in fact, most of the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army were actually trained in British style. They had just finished a brutal war in 1904 and 1905 where they actually wiped out the Russian Army and the Russian Navy. They completely destroyed the Russian Navy in the space of less than a year. So for Europeans, it was an enormous shock because you have to remember by the 1840s, 1850s, but certainly by 1900, Europeans like Americans were stunningly racist. And so the idea that Japanese who were Asians, which meant, in the classic stereotypes of people, yellow, slanted eyes, I mean, this whole set of enormously goofy stereotypes that they had, there was absolutely no way in their view of the world, which was a racist view, which meant that Europeans were just innately built superior, think of sociobiology, and that Japanese could possibly take them on. And here they just beat the crap out of the Russians very, very quickly and absolutely brutally. And the Russians, of course, were your classic haoles, and there's no way that these big haole guys could be beat up by these little Japanese guys in the racist stereotypes of the times. So when it happens, there's this enormous shock in Europe, and all of a sudden, this sort of like this big light bulb goes off in everyone's head in Europe, and they go like, "Holy crap, the Japanese are for real." By the 1914, when World War I starts, Japan has one of the largest navies in the world. It probably has one of the world's best armies, but their navy was absolutely huge, relatively speaking. And their navy hadn't even existed in 1880. So the whole Japanese military establishment had basically come out of nothing in about 25, 30 years. Now, in that context, the United States was certainly vaguely aware that the Japanese were up to this and up to that. But again, the American ethnocentrism, which was anything of any worse than it was in Europe, totally discounted the Japanese or any Asians as being at all relevant, except as, weird da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Think of Chinatowns and little Tokyos and stuff like that. So Asians were just sort of an irritation, but you didn't have to take them seriously because they were just sort of bogus. They were just sort of like, and they actually a bunch of articles in American newspapers saying Europeans are freaking out about nothing and blame the Russians for screwing up, not the Japanese for doing it right. Segue to World War I. World War I starts, Germany's on one side, the Japanese, British, and French and everyone else are on the other side here in the Pacific. The German ships in the Pacific, which there's a few, immediately have to dive into neutral ports because when the war started, if you're caught at sea, you're either going to get the crap blown out of you and you're going to be sunk, or the enemy's navy is going to take you over and basically capture the ship. Now, because the United States was neutral and Hawaii was part of the United States, a whole bunch, I believe it's 8 or 9 German ships immediately run like hell for Honolulu Harbor, knowing that as long as they get to Honolulu, that's like tagging if you used to play tag when you were a kid, you got the post and you're now safe. If they stay in Honolulu Harbor, then the Japanese, the British, or whoever can't get them until somehow this sorts itself out. Now, so it's 1914, and literally within a couple of days of the start of the war, a whole herd then of German ships, well, I don't know if it's a herd, show up in Honolulu Harbor. The most significant one is this little boat here. This is actually a small German cruiser. I think it was called the Geier or something like that. She's pretty goofy. You notice we're still talking steam technology, so you still have mast and sails just in case you really screw up. But the technology was getting a little better. This wasn't a new boat. I think she looks like she's probably about 20 years old at the time. So she's sort of old tech. But she was one of the German military craft, and she's too small to fight the European powers, the Allies in the Pacific. So she runs like hell and gets to Honolulu literally about 8 hours before the Japanese ships are chasing her. So it's this massive sort of, like in a bad TV show, this massive chase going down the Pacific with these guys, hauling ass just in front of this huge Japanese squadron. Now, the Americans, of course, because of the neutrality, immediately allow her to stay here. I think she's pictured about 6 months later. Now she's got washing hanging up here. She's not looking very military. The German crew probably was really happy because here they are in Hawaii versus all the other Germans who are getting their butts shot off in Europe or someplace else. So they must have been pretty stoked that they weren't in the middle of the war. The word sort of missed them unintentionally. And the Americans are sort of like, well, okay, but this is a neutrality thing. Here's the German crew. They were allowed to go around Honolulu and do stuff as long as they were, monitored. And this is what she looks like. So this is the ship. And there were also a bunch of merchant ships. You can see on the left-hand side, there's one of the steamships, the cargo ships that got here along with her. Now, the ships that have been chasing her were a whole different animal. There's one of them there. The Japanese Navy, as I mentioned, was one of the most powerful and most modern navies in the world in 1914. And in fact, these are the German ships right here. This is a real interesting picture taken from Aloha Tower. So if you notice, this Japanese ship is literally parked. You know, I used to go paddling off of here. That would be almost where we turn the canoe around to come back in on the surf. So this sucker is really close. In fact, this is totally illegal. They're supposed to be 7 miles offshore. This ain't no 7 miles. And the reason the Japanese are doing this is this is the German ships. Here's one of the Japanese ships. These things are monsters. They're absolutely huge. By 1914 standards, the epitome of technology. I think this one's literally brand new at the time. So they have these huge crews. They're heavily armed. They've got these massive guns. They're everything but a battleship. And there's 4 of these things parked offshore like a pack of wolves. And they immediately demand, that's what this picture is here, they immediately demand that the United States give up the German ships so they can take them and sink them. The Commodore that was in charge of the Japanese squadron doesn't ask. He says, you guys have got to cough these ships up. They belong to us. And the Americans are like, dude, we're neutral. You know, you can't do that. There's neutrality laws, et cetera, et cetera. The Japanese basically, we don't give a crap. And the American ships in Honolulu Harbor were very small. They weren't much better than that German one. And the American Navy in the Pacific was very small. The vast majority of the American Navy is in the Atlantic because, of course, we're always paranoid about the Europeans. And the United States, even today, is more focused on Europe. So the end result is there's nothing to tell these guys no. And it gets probably within about 2 days of war. Twice the guy who's in charge of this squadron actually aims the ship's guns at Honolulu Harbor and says, if you don't cough up these ships, we're going to shell the harbor and sink them indirectly. And if there's American casualties, well, that's just tough shit. You know, you guys have been told. And there's nothing in the entire, basically Pacific area of the United States that can fight these things. They completely outclass anything that the Americans have in this part of the world. America goes absolutely nuts. We're trying to stay neutral. We want to stay neutral. It's only 1914, 15, so you got to tune in the years of this. What the Japanese do then is really creepy. They go and they capture this little German sailing ship. She was running, I think, coconut oil up from Samoa. She sails up here. They didn't even know there was a war on. They didn't have radio or anything. They just like doing their thing. They get up here and she probably captured her. They tow this little white boat right outside of Honolulu Harbor. In fact, not too far from this picture. I think it was right over here somewhere. They park her out here, take the crew off, and use her for target practice and sink her. And what the Commodore was trying to tell the United States is, we'll practice on this one. And if you guys don't get your act together and cough these ships up, then we're going to do you next. So they're basically trying to bully the United States into coughing up these ships in Honolulu. The British and the French, who are allies of the Japanese, just tell the Americans, well, you know, if you're not going to join the cause, then you got to deal with the Japanese yourself. The United States government doesn't know what to do for 2 reasons. One is they have nothing that can fight these things in this part of the world. And it would take literally 3 to 6 months to get the ships from other parts of the world to do this, which is way too late. Secondly, is they had totally, for some reason, being dumb and ethnocentric and racist, it totally hadn't dawned on them these guys are for real. I mean, personally, from my standpoint, I don't know, hey, I can't see something like this and figure this sucker's real. They had like 8 of these buggers, and they had 3 or 4 of them constantly rotating, parked off of Honolulu, just waiting for someone to do something. It's like a whole shoal of, 15-foot long tiger sharks out there, just, waiting. And here's just before they sunk this ship. Absolutely massive monsters. And so what happens is this eventually diffuses. The Japanese government decides it's not worth the trouble of picking a war with the United States and forcing the United States on the side of Germany just to catch a few stupid little boats in Honolulu. So they back down, the Commodore's ordered off, and the ships disappear a couple of months later. Now, it's not so much that this happened, but the key thing here is from that moment on, the United States has this their light bulb goes off in their head. They go, holy crap, the Japanese are real and this threat is real. These things are the most technologically advanced warships of the time. If you notice, they don't have any sailing masts. These things run off of oil. So they can go for thousands of miles and never refuel. And they did. They just parked off of Honolulu and just waited. They were running the whole time. They didn't need to refuel. So the new technology of the 20th century, which was oil-based, meant on one hand, you don't need the coaling station anymore. but it also reinforced the fact that Honolulu, especially Pearl Harbor, was absolutely central, because you're going to have these monsters showing up. And so what happens is, after that event, is all of a sudden, rather than just being a coaling station in a small harbor, now Pearl Harbor is seen as the spot in which you're going to have the fight with Japan, which from this moment on is what the United States become convinced. By 1915-16, after that event in Honolulu, the United States is firmly convinced the next major war they're going to have after World War I's done is going to be with Japan. And in part, that's just because the Japanese were so technologically advanced, but also in a really big part is because the Japanese were so incredibly attitudinally aggressive towards the United States. I mean, they were actually threatening a part of another country to get a few stupid ships. It was totally out of whack with, the threat level was totally out of whack with what you were going to get out of it. And it sort of opened up the United States government eyes in Washington, D.C., that the Japanese were not going to be tolerant, the Japanese were not going to be buddies, and this was going to go down badly at some point. And so what happens is from 1915 on, the United States pours an enormous amount of money into the defenses and protection of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor becomes the most defended and most expensive naval base in the entire United States from 1916 right into 1946. And you see it when you look around here, and especially in our neighborhood. Diamond Head. Diamond Head gets taken over by the American government, and the entire thing is one giant fort. The whole thing in the front's honeycombed. Here you can see two of the military emplacements here. Inside the fort, there were gun emplacements. When you walk up the side of Diamond Head, you're walking up, that's a military track for, again, emplacements. The whole thing was one giant military facility. On the Malka side, you have Battery Harlow and two other batteries. These absolutely enormous, you can still see these on this side from KCC. These absolutely huge things that were designed to mount these absolutely enormous cannon whose sole function was to fire shells to protect Pearl Harbor from invasion. They were built in the late 17s, early 1920s. What's now KCC was Fort Ruger, and this was a huge military post. All these were military buildings, and in fact, there's still a little bit of this left down when you go down the street. If you go Diamond Head Road, you can still see a little bit of this. When you first go right here, there's the actual gatehouse that's left of the old military installation. That's why the National Guard and everything still has their facilities there. So this thing was huge, but this thing wasn't to protect Honolulu. There was absolutely nothing at Diamond Head that was to protect the Hawaiian island of Oahu or the people living in Oahu. Its only function was to use its guns to protect access to Pearl Harbor. So you have Fort Kamehameha, you end up with 9 military forts whose function is purely to protect Pearl Harbor. So by the 1920s, and especially during the Depression, a huge proportion of the US military budget is being spent on Pearl Harbor. They buy Fort Island and turn this whole area into a giant military base, though the US military doesn't take over the back part till World War II starts. The reason for Schofield was to make a US Army base whose soldiers were supposed to march down here and protect Pearl Harbor. This is one reason, if you ever look at the military installations here, you suddenly realize that there's no military installations to protect Honolulu. They were all to do this. The Marines were over here to come across the Pali and protect Pearl Harbor. That's why H3 was built in the 1980s. H3 was built so it'd be easier for the Marines to get from Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station to Pearl Harbor. And you not by accident look at where the bugger goes. It doesn't go to Honolulu, it goes to Pearl Harbor. So the entire US military function, one, was Pearl Harbor. So they spent no money on military installations outside of anything tied to Pearl Harbor. Were not interested in the defense of the Hawaiian Islands. All they were interested in was this. So everything is tied to it. Secondly, the military is pouring millions and millions and millions of dollars. And by the 1920s and 30s, there isn't a lot of money in the United States. The Depression kicks in, stuff like that. They don't care. This place becomes so critical. It's where you're going to stop Japan. So this becomes the place that you're going to do it. And you're going to do it by virtue of the US Navy being parked here. And they're going to have a battle with Japan off to the west somewhere. And then they're going to win that battle, and then the United States will be safe. So the United States view of the whole thing is that if you have the battle here, if you have the Navy here and you have your war here, then what you're not having is you're not having the war in San Francisco. You're not having the war in the US mainland. So they see Hawaii as like an airbag or a bumper. You use Hawaii as a place to have the war with Japan, which is going to happen in their view, so that you don't have it actually impact the American civilians and the real United States, which is the US mainland. Now, what that means is from the 1915 period on, is the US military becomes the biggest spender of money in the Hawaiian Islands. And the US military is still the single biggest revenue stream in the Hawaiian Islands. Tourism is bigger when tourism was going like it was in say mid-2019. But tourism was all over the place. There were a bunch of people had their fingers in the pie on a bunch of different things that are going on, airlines, hotels, whatever. With the military, it's only one thing, it's the Department of Defense. And the military is still one of the largest phenomena here. The US military is one of the largest landowners in the Hawaiian Islands. The amount of land they own, especially around Schofield, is actually sort of mind-blowing. You have Tripler Hospital. Military dependents are one of the single largest economic populations that are actually a tied population in the Hawaiian Islands. Military spending is like $1 out of $10 in Hawaii. So it's absolutely an enormous part of the revenue. But for our purpose in a geography class, the key is it's entirely focused on one spot. It has nothing to do with the other islands, has nothing to do with anything else but Pearl Harbor. So military spending here isn't spent in the islands. Military spending is spent in Honolulu or more generally on the island of Oahu only. Now, where that becomes really critical then is it means that you're going to get infrastructure building. So the military pours a lot of money into building roads and stuff in the area around here and developing facilities to roads, for example, to get from Schofield down to Pearl Harbor. So they're pouring tons of money into roads, water, and all the other type of 20th century infrastructure things that are very expensive. The military is totally okay paying for them as long as it benefits them. They're not interested in what happens over here. They're not interested in what happens over there or anyplace else. It's all sort of this sort of V-shaped thing between Schofield, Kaneohe, and here. But they're such a big spender that the single largest spender. Now, this is also why, if you think about it, we get called the city and county of Honolulu, not the county of Oahu, unlike the other counties. And that's because it's largely driven by the military interests, which are entirely focused here. In the period right to the end of World War II, 1945-46, the military has one of the largest single visible features in the Hawaiian Islands, but it's only visible here. There were basically no military facilities on the other islands till World War II starts up. So what happens, among other things, is Honolulu and Oahu in general becomes very, very westernized because it's got this enormous military bases. And you have to remember the population is so small, relatively speaking, here in the 1920s and 30s, that 1 out of 10 people on the island of Oahu was military or military dependent. It was a staggering proportion of the population, totally out of whack with anywhere in the mainland United States, except maybe within 5 miles of a military base. So all intents and purposes, you argue Oahu basically turns into the world's largest military base. So what you end up is disproportionate spending, all focused on one particular thing, which is defense, and all focused on one particular place, which is Pearl Harbor. Everything is sort of like, not relevant. And so there's still a lot of this that still remains. One is the military is still, again, one of the largest spenders here. They still have an enormous impact here in the Hawaiian Islands, relatively speaking. Probably equally relevant is for almost all the other federal agencies, there's very little interest in Hawaii, because if for the other parts of federal government, housing, education, all the rest of that, we're a territory up until 1959. So we're really not on the charts. They're not going to spend money on us, because if you're the Department of Education at the US federal level, you're getting money that has to be okayed by Congress. Congressmen are going to give you money because you do something that makes them look good back home. You have to remember, if you're a territory, you have no congressmen. You have observers in Congress, but they're not congressmen since they don't vote on anything. So they're not going to vote on the budget allocations for Department of Education. So if you're a federal agency, you have absolutely no interest in Hawaii. There's no way that you're going to do anything for them because they can't do anything for you. So the educational system is lousy in terms of federal money. Housing is lousy in terms of federal money. Health services, all these type of stuff are incredibly bad. No different than Guam or Puerto Rico or any place. The only thing that's completely off the charts is the military. But because the military has a very interesting way it looks at the world, the military is not interested in the island of Oahu, except for how it impacts the military's need, which is very mission focused, as the military would say. And the mission focus was Pearl Harbor. So when you look at the territorial period, you really have to remember that the territorial period was pretty much the Department of Defense, largely the US Navy, and a territorial government that was always going to basically do what the US Navy needed and wanted, because that's where all the money's coming from. The only other money you got coming out of Hawaii is pineapple and sugar. And that's not a lot of money, relatively speaking, compared to what the military is spending. The amount spent, for example, on Diamond Head or Fort DeRussy in Waikiki was probably the equivalent of the entire territory's budget for 5 years. You know, those are just two major, absolutely massive, but major military installations, of which there were just tons of them in the islands. You know, Fort Barrett is probably the most famous. If you go out to Eva, the huge thing was actually used battleship guns on it to protect, protect Pearl Harbor. And this is why you still have a mixed airport. Honolulu Airport was originally, of course, what it still is Hickam Field. It was a military airport, and they let civilian planes land in it, but it was a military air base. And what was it tied to? Pearl Harbor, which it's a part of. So, you know, a lot of what you see around you even today is still basically in some way, shape, or form military. There's the massive military depot storage up here somewhere. I can't remember where, up in here, which people now rent out. You got huge amounts of military housing. The military still controls everything that you see right here in this image, in fact, a little more. So the military was a massive, massive 800-pound gorilla in the Hawaiian world of the 20th century, right till basically 1946. In fact, maybe better to say till 1959, until we get statehood. And that becomes key, because then what the military wants, the military gets. And if you want anything else in the rest of the island, you have to convince the military to somehow foot part of the bill, because you've got no money. And if you're on the outer islands, you're just completely off the charts. No one's interested in what Kauai wants or what Maui wants or what the Big Island wants. So to a certain extent, those places sort of truck along. In fact, in the case of the outer islands, in fact, that's why we call them the outer islands. When you think about it, that makes no sense. But it's the outer islands to the military, because it's outside of Pearl Harbor. So a lot of even the terms we use, even today, reflect this. And this is one reason why the other islands, especially Maui and the Big Islands, which Maui is the one I'm most familiar with, really don't have a lot to do with Oahu. They don't like Oahu, and this is why they very frequently, if you've noticed with the COVID thing, they don't pay a lot of attention to what the state's doing. They're pretty much going to do their own thing, because their history in the 20th century has been that everything in the state of Hawaii and everything in the territory of Hawaii was focused on Pearl Harbor and the island of Oahu, and specifically Honolulu. And the rest of the islands could just sort of go play with themselves. No one cared. So what they did is they got very self-sufficient. They pretty much had to figure out how to survive on their own resources. It made no sense to ask the territory, and it made no sense obviously to ask the military for stuff. So you don't get the sense of like you would in most states in the United States, that there's different parts of the state and they work in different ways, but they're all part of a state. If you look at Hawaii, what you really get is there's two states here. There's the state of Oahu, and there's the state of everything else. And then you see the COVID thing's probably a classic case in point. That's just the most recent in 2020. So this becomes this huge issue. The military is such an enormously powerful and dominant force. We still are. Pearl Harbor is still one of the top 3 military installations in the United States. Pearl Harbor geographically is the largest harbor under entirely military control in the world. There's no other harbor of this size which only has military access. Even Vladivostok or Russian seaports all have mutual civilian military access. We'll see near the end of the semester, this has become a huge issue for the state of Hawaii. So for example, the state of Hawaii has to use this incredibly small cramped area over here for everything from containers to cargo ships to, cruise liners and everything. And this absolutely enormous area over here is only subject to military. If Lucy or someone else has a little boat and they try to sail through here, you're immediately going to have a bunch of U.S. Marines and Navy personnel and our ribbies with machine guns in front. And they're going to be on lock and load, and you've got 2 minutes to get out, and then they open fire. They've got shoot to kill orders if you go through here. And the reason, very simply, is we've got up to 8 to 14 nuclear subs with nuclear weapons at all times, either in or around Pearl Harbor. We're the main nuclear sub base in the entire United States outside of San Diego. So a large part of the nuclear deterrence in terms of nuclear weapons aimed at the rest of the planet is based directly or indirectly here. So it really hasn't changed at all in 2020, especially with increasing emphasis on China and stuff like that. Pearl Harbor has ramped back up to, in some ways, almost what it looked like in 1944. Now, of course, the Japanese figure this out because they're not stupid. And that's why their attack on Pearl Harbor was such an interesting attack, because it was probably as much psychological as it was technical. By attacking this place, it was the most defended military base in the world, probably outside of Singapore, and just hammering the bejesus out of the U.S. Navy here. You not only take out a large part of the U.S. Navy, which was parked here just to threaten Japan, which was the whole reason for building this place, but you're also telling them that it's vulnerable. And you're basically saying, just like in 1914, we can threaten you guys, here it's 1941 and we can blow the crap out of you. And that's why Pearl Harbor was such an enormous shock to the United States. One, it was because it was a military attack, but the United States had spent a large part of its military budget for the last 40 years prior to that attack, making this place invulnerable. And they blew it. You know, the place got wiped. And, you know, that was the basis of that. And it's not by accident when you think about it. Pearl Harbor becomes the trauma of the United States. But it's not in the United States. It's on an island in the Pacific. And you see that trauma even into 2020. When you think of the Arizona Memorial. Millions of people come to visit this thing every year. By now, there's almost no one left that fought in World War II that's still alive. The ship is still partially there. The memorial's there, and millions of people come to sort of mull over. I don't know what they do at Pearl Harbor, to be honest. There's a really good work that a guy did on that. But to them, it's hugely emotionally and, you know, politically, whatever. Japanese also come in large numbers to Pearl Harbor, because for them it's the start of what eventually ended with the destruction of the Japanese home islands. They get completely burned out by 1945. So Pearl Harbor, for almost everyone involved, is still so symbolically powerful. But when you think about it, it's not San Francisco Bay, it's not San Diego, it's not New York. But in some ways, you know, it's the equivalent, because it was made such an image and such a symbol by the United States military from 1910 on, but specifically after World War I, because of that 1950 scenario, that when World War II starts with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the shock is just mind-blowing. And so it's in that context, and even in that context, what you find is the enormous discussion is, if you look at the even, you know, movie accounts and everything, there's very little cognizance given to the other U.S. military bases, the loss of life over in Kaneohe and stuff. It's all sort of, you know, peripheral to what happens here at Pearl Harbor. And this is one reason why the U.S. Navy, and we were involved in some efforts back in the 1980s and 90s for the state, trying to get the U.S. Navy to cough up parts of Pearl Harbor for civilian use, since they're not using about 80% of it. And they just said no. And one of the things they brought up is they're not going to give it Pearl Harbor. It's going to be over their dead body, because Pearl Harbor to them represents something other than just a technical place. It's not just a military base. In some ways, it's almost like the soul of the U.S. Navy, more so than San Diego Naval Station or, you know, what they have in San Francisco and stuff. They've given up most stuff in San Francisco. So you end up with this paradox. You've got this enormous piece of real estate that's not really very heavily used, that is central to the U.S. Navy's identity in the 21st century, and in large part drives a lot of the stuff that goes on here. So that becomes the territorial period. In a real succinct way, you can argue the territorial period here. This becomes the center of all that gravity. And when you look at the territorial period here, one of the things you realize very quickly is Honolulu develops into a pretty good sized city really quickly. Not so much the rest of the island, not so much the other islands. And when you look at it, that sort of makes sense if you realize this is the big cash cow here. It's not tourism. Tourism doesn't start up till the last part of the 20th century. This is where all the money is. This is where the power is. This is where the population is. And you can actually see it at this scale. You can even see it with the roads. Look at the road systems here, here, and here. So for a geographer, Pearl Harbor is hugely important, just because the United States invested staggering sums of money, and still does, in Pearl Harbor. If you notice, the most recent thing was the idea of putting up an enormous radar facility somewhere over here, I can't remember where, for the purpose of tracking ballistic missiles coming in. For the North Korean defense, for the Chinese defense, for the anti-Russian defense, Pearl Harbor is seen as the major military installation in the Pacific. Guam and the Philippines, especially Guam, they're disposable. Pearl Harbor isn't. But again, Pearl Harbor's purpose is still basically to provide a really, really big bullseye, so someone doesn't think of taking the West Coast down. So when you look at the US mainland, the way that folks on the mainland, especially the federal government, view Hawaii, that's in large part why even in 2020, they see Hawaii the way that they do. It's still seen as largely a huge military base with some ancillary areas, and now seen as very pretty. It's got a lot of tourism, but it's still seen within this view of military expenditures and also as the huge protection shield. That's the term the Navy likes to use, to protect the West Coast part of the United States from North Korea, China, Russia, whoever else it happens to be this week. So in that context, that's the territorial period. It really is Pearl Harbor. And if you understand that, then all of a sudden almost everything else that happens here makes sense. And what you find then ironically is the US Navy first is one of the forces that tries to keep the territory a territory, because they see themselves as actually running the government here. In the Massey case, which we won't get into in this class, is a perfect case in point, where the military feels it has special rights in Hawaii, that the military can do stuff no one else can do, and the territory can't tell them no, because they're the US military and their job is to protect the United States. So their mission is more important than what people might want. Now, what this also means, ironically, is when World War II is going on, you end up with, of course, this enormous process occurring very, very quickly. Major one for us, which, again, if you talk to your great-grandparents or someone that maybe was alive back then, is within a day of the attack, is that military law is declared here. Military law is a real interesting concept because military law basically says that civilian law doesn't exist anymore. Now, it's easy to implement here because we were only a territory. So from December 8th, 1941, the military runs the Hawaiian Islands. The civilian government isn't relevant anymore. The military asked the civilian government to stay on, but the military is running here. So from 1941 on until late 1944, we are a military zone. Now, that means, among other things, if Madeline or Kahana or someone is actually, and they've got their lights on in their house and it's nighttime, the military will come by and shoot the lights of your house out. And if you do it again, they'll arrest you for treason. And theoretically, if you kept it up long enough, they could shoot you. Because you're breaking military law. There's no difference on being in a military base, and we are in a war zone. So till late 1944, an execution offense was what could happen if you did something wrong. There was no civilian law. There's no writ of habeas corpus. So the military ran this place, literally, for the next 3 years. The other thing that happens at the same point is because it's under military law, the military reserves the right to take any and all property that it needs for the duration of the war. This is a hugely important phrase. Now, the military only owned roughly about 1/10 of Pearl Harbor in 1941. By December 9th, 1941, 2 days later, they take over all of Pearl Harbor. One of the bigger towns in Honolulu is actually where the Aloha Stadium is now. Now it's called Harbor Town. It was not a very inventive name. But there was a large population that lived there. That was a main recreation area for people to go sailing and goofing around in Pearl Locks. There were huge populations living around the other parts of the area. The entire fishing fleet was based in Honolulu Harbor. They're all, I should say, in Pearl Harbor. They're all immediately confiscated. The ships are sunk, and everyone's evicted. And everyone's told, here's a piece of paper. We're going to take your property till the war is finished, and then you get your property back. If we made any improvements to the property, we put a house on it, paved it, or whatever, you get to keep those. But you have no say in the property. We take it because we have that right and we have that need to make the war a success and for the United States to win the war. Now, this happened a lot in the West Coast too. Huge parts of San Francisco, et cetera, were also taken over as confiscated of property. On the outer islands, this is the first time they see the military. The military confiscates enormous parts of the Hawaiian Islands. Huge parts. Actually, the majority of East Maui, for example, large areas outside of Lahaina are taken over by the military for bombing areas. Kaho'olawe is taken over for bombing. All central part of Maui is taken over as an enormous air base, all the way from Kahului down to Kihei. Big Island, same thing. Pohakaloa becomes a military base in 1941, taken over by the military. Now, the military doesn't pay a penny for these places. The military is taking them over temporarily So eventually the military is saying, we're borrowing these places until the war's finished, at which point you get it back. And, you know, what were you going to do? If you complain to them, they'd shoot you, you know, because this is the war effort. You can't complain about it. It is what it is. So on the Hawaiian Islands, especially the other islands, all of a sudden the military just bang, just shows up in the space of a couple of weeks. And the entire Hawaiian Islands changed sort of, you know, in a minute into a new form, which has the military absolutely everywhere. Now, the military is not only absolutely everywhere in terms of, you know, numbers. If you look at these numbers, they're sort of mind-blowing. You know, 400,000 acres taken over literally overnight in the Hawaiian Islands, which is a huge problem when you figure that's actually useful land is taken over. What they also do is they put an enormous amount of construction. They build all these huge airports. Kahului Airport is built. Lehui Airport's built. All these airports are, Hilo Airport originally is a military airport. Almost all your airports in the Hawaiian Islands are built by the military. The military improves all the ports in the Hawaiian Islands for military use. So the military spends literally billions of dollars in Hawaii between 1941 and 1945, making this into this absolutely enormous military base. One of the major things they do is they bring in millions of service personnel to basically fight the war. So Hawaii becomes where, if you're in the US military, Hawaii is where you learn how to fight in the Pacific. So almost all the military are trained here in the Hawaiian Islands, whether it be Navy, Army, Marines, whatever. So here's where the big training facilities were. This is how you learn how to use your weapons. This is how you learn to get ready. And this is where you stage the military out. So if you're going to invade Okinawa or Guam or something like that, that's all centered in Pearl Harbor. They set it up. Pearl Harbor becomes the center of that, and then you ship them out to where you're ever going to have the next part of the war. So Honolulu becomes absolutely I should say Pearl Harbor, but Honolulu in general specifically becomes the center of this millions and millions person war effort. Again, totally out of whack with the US mainly because you don't have a large civilian population here. So in the outer islands, for example, on Maui by 1943, in some place like Kahului, you have 10 to 20 service personnel for every person who actually is born on Maui. So all of a sudden, literally from no one over there at all, you end up with this enormous population of people that have been in Hawaii for maybe a week or two. They're all in military uniforms. They're all going to be sent off to fight in the war somewhere. And that becomes the impact of the US military in Hawaii. So the first impact is the economic one, Pearl Harbor, and then later the World War II expansion. The second is the legal one. For the 4-year period, we're under military law, which all of a sudden means all those little, you know, sweetheart deals about land control and who got water and stuff like that they'd set up under the territory and stuff with the missionary boys, they cease to exist for 4 years. Third is the massive increase in population for very short periods and very temporary periods, who are then shipped off to the rest of the war. Now you still see this. The Halekoa Hotel in Waikiki is a part of this whole process. You set up actual facilities for military officers to relax in Waikiki at the same time that most of the other hotels are closed. You have Tripler, the massive US military hospital complex set up to help treat injured in World War II. So all these things are still around that were part of this whole process built in this period. So the military basically in large case sort of shapes us in this period. And it's really important to understand when you're trying to figure out how Hawaii looks like it does and what ends up with, because a lot of this stuff gets very confusing, just sort of get us ready for next time. Because unlike the mainland, in many cases, the United States military here doesn't give the property back at the end of the war. We'll get into why next time. But basically what happens here is that the United States military decides to keep a lot of stuff. And again, remember, they paid almost nothing for all of Pearl Harbor, and the military still controls it in 2020. You can still talk to old Japanese families, for example, who all had land down near Aloha Stadium, and they lost it in 1941. And they're still sort of like, well, you know, I have a piece of paper. I'm the actual owner of the land. The military gave me a piece of paper saying they were going to give it back at the end of the war. That was 1945. It's now 2020. It's like, what? So this becomes an enormously complex problem, as we'll see that parlays into a huge amount of ways here, not the least of which would be Kaho'olawe. Okay, is that all sort of, that tears us through back to the last, basically, first half of the 20th century? Does that sort of make sense? Everyone's getting really passive in this class. Oh, well, I guess it is what it is. Oh yeah, as a note, you should have got an announcement. I have the training vids set up for the different parts of the Palolo project. if you actually told me what you wanted to do, hopefully I've actually got you set up. I'm going to send emails out today linking the folks in this class to the folks in the free 40 class that are doing the same part of the project. So you'll know who's on it, so you guys can coordinate, who wants to do what in terms of like maybe where, what parts. If you didn't ever tell me what it was you're going to do, then I get to choose what you're going to do. So, you're sort of in a you snooze, you lose part, and you're now in the you snooze, you lose, because I'm going to arbitrarily make assignments today. There are all the training videos set up in terms of what I want you guys to actually do, at least initially, so you guys can get started. You've got access to the folder with a lot of the resources. You guys should be good to go. I'm going to try to get that all sorted out today, so at least I can actually tell you guys, okay, now it's go before we get into October. Okay, any questions about anything? No, everyone just wants out. Okay.